Decimation derived from the Latin word decimatio, removal of a tenth. The practice was Roman military justice reduced to its most brutal arithmetic. When a legion mutinied or displayed collective cowardice in battle, the standard punishments proved insufficient. Individual executions couldn't address systemic failure. The unit itself had become contaminated. Its honor was irretrievable through conventional means. So Rome invented a punishment that turned soldiers into executioners of their own brothers, a ritual designed to reconstruct royalty through collective trauma. The condemned unit was assembled as a whole body before their comrades. The commanding officer drew lots from the entire group of transgressors, selecting approximately 1/10 for execution. The ancient ratio remained constant. 1 man out of every 10 would die. Every guilty soldier faced equal odds. Individual merit didn't matter. Battlefield experience didn't matter. Seniority didn't matter. The lottery's brutal impartiality was the mechanism of terror, punishment distributed with mathematical precision across every man who had failed Rome. Those who drew the fatal lot were beaten to death by the survivors. The method was called fustorium, clubbed with wooden staffs or stoned until death. The executioners weren't professional soldiers. They were tent mates, friends, brothers in arms forced to kill the men they had betrayed Rome alongside. The practice tracked back to Rome's earliest military traditions. The historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus documented decimation in the early Republic around 471 BCE. It was never codified as law. It existed as ancestral custom, something commanders invoked when conventional discipline collapsed. Only officers holding imperium, supreme military authority granted directly by the Roman state, could order decimation. This wasn't mob justice or spontaneous violence. It was calculated institutional cruelty sanctioned at the highest level of Roman power. By the late Republic, decimation had largely fallen into disuse. Commanders considered it too extreme, too barbaric, even by Roman standards. But when crises emerged that threatened the very foundation of military discipline, it returned. Decimation wasn't designed to punish a specific individual. It was designed to reconstruct the unit's collective identity through ritualized violence. The randomness eliminated any sense that individual virtue could protect you. The forced participation severed the bonds of solidarity that had enabled the original transgression. The punishment transformed mutiny from an act of collective resistance into an act of collective suicide. It made betrayal psychologically unbearable by ensuring that survival required killing your co-conspirators. Rome didn't need every soldier to be brave. It needed every soldier to fear their own comrades more than they feared the enemy. Before the lottery began, the condemned unit was assembled before the entire army. The tribune delivered a public reproach. Every soldier in the legion would witness what happened to those who broke the sacred bond of military discipline. The Greek historian Polybius documented the procedure in precise detail. Writing in the 2nd century BCE, he described how the tribune approached each man selected by lot and merely touches him with a staff. That touch was the death sentence. No trial, no defense, no appeal. The ritual's formality was deliberate. This wasn't chaos. This was state-sanctioned execution dressed in military ceremony. The commanding officer drew lots from the assembled guilty soldiers. Methods varied by commander preference, but the mathematical outcome remained constant. Approximately 1 man out of every 10 was selected for death. Some sources describe lots drawn from the whole body at once. Others mention subdivision into smaller groups. Polybius himself documented the practice where the entire condemned unit drew simultaneously, each man facing equal probability. Regardless of method, the ratio never changed. The ancient formula of decimatio, 1/10 removed, was absolute. The randomness was the point. Courage couldn't save you. Cowardice couldn't doom you more than it already had. The lottery made punishment impersonal, mathematical, and inescapable. Those who drew the fatal lot were immediately separated. They weren't granted final words. They weren't allowed to prepare. The condemned were beaten to death by their surviving comrades using clubs and stones. The executioners weren't strangers. They were tent mates forced to kill the men they had failed Rome alongside. Friends raising clubs against friends. Brothers stoning brothers. The psychological violence was as calculated as the physical brutality. The survivors became perpetrators. Their hands were stained with blood. The bonds of solidarity that had enabled mutiny were severed through forced participation in murder. You couldn't claim innocence when you had killed your co-conspirator. The surviving 9/10 of the unit faced additional punishment. They were expelled from the protection of the camp's fortified walls and forced to pitch tents outside. Their diet was changed from wheat, the standard Roman military ration, to barley, the food of animals and slaves. This degradation continued for weeks or months, depending on the commander's judgment. The units remained operational but marked. They had to earn back their status as Roman soldiers through exemplary service. Decimation didn't simply execute a fraction of the guilty, it reconstructed the entire unit through ritualized trauma, ensuring that every survivor carried the psychological weight of what they had done and witnessed. The punishment didn't end when the clubs fell silent, it lived in the minds of those who remained. Two cases from the late Republic reveal how the same punishment could produce radically different outcomes depending on timing, context, and strategic purpose. The first shaped an army, the second merely punished one already broken. Marcus Licinius Crassus inherited a catastrophe. The slave revolt led by Spartacus had humiliated Rome repeatedly. Two consular armies defeated in 72 BCE. The legions assigned to Crassus were described in ancient sources as corrupted by luxury and idleness, their reputation for cowardice threatening Rome's authority across the Mediterranean. But the crisis escalated when Crassus's own legate, Mummius, received explicit orders. Command two legions but do not engage the enemy. Mummius disobeyed. Spartacus routed the Romans completely. Soldiers threw away their arms and fled, abandoning their standards, the sacred symbols of Roman military honor. Crassus faced the choice. He could execute Mummius for insubordination, but that wouldn't address the systemic rot in the legions themselves. Individual punishment couldn't reconstruct an army that had learned to fear the enemy more than their own commanders. Crassus identified the cohorts that had fled first. He assembled them before the entire army. Then he ordered decimation. Approximately 500 men were selected by lot. They were clubbed to death by their surviving comrades in a public ritual designed to be witnessed by every legionary in Crassus's command. Plutarch recorded that Crassus became a more dangerous commander to his own soldiers than Spartacus was. The punishment wasn't meant to be fair, it was meant to be unforgettable. The decimation worked. Crassus had revived an ancestral punishment that Appian noted had been long out of use. He weaponized it to fundamentally alter the psychological calculus of his army. In their first engagement after the decimation, Crassus's transformed legions encountered 10,000 of Spartacus's forces. The same soldiers who had thrown down their weapons and fled weeks earlier now fought with calculated ferocity. Spartacus's forces were annihilated. The legion's psychological transformation was complete. Fear of Crassus had exceeded fear of death. The army that had fled in panic weeks earlier now fought with ruthless discipline. Fear of the commander had exceeded fear of death in battle. Crassus didn't just restore discipline, he created soldiers who understood that survival required absolute obedience. The decimation became the psychological foundation for the campaign that would ultimately crush the Spartacus revolt. 65 years later, Mark Antony faced a very different crisis during Rome's invasion of Parthia. His campaign had devolved into strategic catastrophe. Deep in enemy territory, his legions were starving, harassed by constant Parthians' ambushes, and trapped in a grueling retreat through hostile terrain. When a Roman foraging party was ambushed, the soldiers broke and fled. Antony, perhaps remembering Crassus's success, ordered the guilty cohorts decimated. Every 10th man was selected by lot and executed. The survivors received barley rations instead of wheat, marking them as degraded and animal-like. But Antony's decimation produced no miracle. The sources report that the immediate results were far less spectacular than those achieved by Crassus. The punishment may have prevented further instances of outright flight, but it did nothing to solve the fundamental problems destroying Antony's army. His soldiers were still starving, the Parthians were still attacking, the strategic situation remained hopeless. Antony had applied the same punishment Crassus used, but in completely different circumstances. The decimation became a futile act of rage against an army already broken by forces beyond its control. The contrast between Crassus and Antony reveals decimation's true nature. It wasn't simply a punishment, it was a psychological instrument whose effectiveness depended entirely on timing and context. Crassus used it proactively at the campaign's beginning to forge a functional army from demoralized troops before decisive battles. It worked because the war was still winnable. Antony used it reactively during a disastrous threat to punish soldiers in a campaign already lost. It failed because no amount of terror could reserve strategic collapse and starvation. Both commanders employed the same ritual, but only one created an army that could win. The other merely added execution to a list of disasters his soldiers had already endured. These two cases reveal decimation's true nature. It wasn't simply a punishment, it was psychological warfare waged against Rome's own soldiers. Crassus used it to forge an army before decisive battles. Antony used it to punish soldiers in a campaign already lost. Same ritual, opposite outcomes. The practice was extraordinarily rare. Ancient sources describe it as a desperate measure, largely abandoned by the imperial era. But its legend far exceeded its actual use. Decimation worked not because it was just or even effective. It worked when commanders convinced their soldiers that betrayal carried consequences more terrible than death itself. The lottery selected the dead, the ritual reconstructed the living, and the legend long outlived the practice.